D.W. Phillips is a documentary filmmaker and constitutional attorney with Ukraine Story, a non-profit foundation for journalism and documentary reporting in Ukraine. He and his documentary team have been filming and conducting interviews in Ukraine with victims of Russian atrocities and reporting stories of courage, defiance, and perseverance of the Ukrainian people. He's reported on Russian atrocities in Bucha and is presently working on issues of Kremlin disinformation campaigns in the American right, the religious liberty in Ukraine, and the KGB domination of the Moscow Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church. And I should say, this is the second time I've been privileged to speak to Douglas. And if you want to check out the first video, I strongly recommend it. There is so much good stuff in there. But watch this one first. And today we're going to touch upon quite a few of those themes, aren't we? I think they're imperative, actually, that we talk about what's going on in the US and the, dare I say, corruption of the media and political sphere.
Jonathan, I want to thank you for having me back here. And I would be remiss not to say that in the weeks or month or so since I've been on the show, I've been listening to your podcast relatively faithfully. As far as I'm concerned, it's just about the best out there. You have a very ironic way of a fact-based but ironic way of interviewing guests, and you're bringing on the best people. I love your show. Thanks for having me on. It's a privilege.
It's fantastic, and it's stimulating as well, because to one extent, when it comes to the US political system, I know relatively little, except what I see in mainstream media, and of course starting and of course the superficial aspects of the debates in your chambers, which of course are stalled at the moment on Ukraine aid. But how the whole system works behind the scenes, I have no idea.
Well, I'm happy for us to dive into that a little bit. And yes, this is an extraordinarily big week. It's a big week because Speaker Johnson, the Republican Speaker of the House, was defeated in a bill in the last 48 hours from the time of the recording of this broadcast. It was a bill that was unrelated to Ukraine directly. It had to do with FISA, which is sort of an intelligence surveillance system in America, but it's related to Ukraine in that it showed that there was growing disaffection with him on the part of sort of the far right movement within the Republican Party. Now, that will certainly factor in later this week or next week when we actually come down to the question of, will Ukraine get $60 billion from the United States of America, and what will the bill look like that the speaker is going to present? And you and I were speaking before the show. A matter of great personal interest to me, and I hope we can talk about it today, are the tactics which are employed at the last minute. In America, we call last minute tactics an October surprise, meaning that right before the November presidential election, people kind of drop big bombs out there. These aren't big bombs because they've all been things which have been circulated before, but they've been hitting very hard. In fact, virtually every major alt-right media host, I'm speaking of Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, Steve Bannon, we could go down the list, have been repeating almost verbatim the same comments, and they come down to the fact, well, if we support Russia, we're supporting the murder, if we support Ukraine, we're supporting the murder of Christians, the imprisonment of Christians, and after all, this is just a CIA-run and controlled war. It's monumental. In fact, I'm going to use the word galactic ignorance and disinformation, but it's having a very powerful effect in America.
I think what's interesting about that, of course, is that the Russian media has just started over the last couple of weeks to refer to this as a holy war. You have the patriarch that we mentioned in the introduction, who is essentially a KGB agent. I mean, he's not a spiritual leader, and the Russian Orthodox Church is not a spiritual organization. It's a state-run tool of coercion, and it would never act in a way that is contrary to what Putin wants. We've also seen them blessing missiles, including the aptly named Satan. We've seen them blessing tanks on the back of railway trailers, and innumerable acts of absolute, what would be described as blasphemy, I think, by any sort of normal sort of Christian or even human being with their sensibilities intact. So we have the evidence here that this is an extremely unholy war, and that it is a country that is committing grotesque violations of human rights. And if we're going to compare that to the New Testament, violating almost every doctrine that could ever be associated with Jesus, for instance. And yet, you see an entire parallel reality being promulgated by Putin's little helpers. How has this come about? And how is this contrast not apparent to people?
One would think it would be manifestly self-evident, but it isn't. And it isn't for many reasons, including the following. Number one, the American people have reached a point through the preeminence of social media and the polarization which is taking place in America, where they are driven by headlines. They're the same people who were vehemently opposed to mainstream media and the left, what they believed poisoning the American system, giving false information. And in fact, that often happened. The very same people have changed their slave masters to the right. Now they're looking to demagogues who say things are so and believe by virtue of saying it based on their intuition that it must be so. And the American people hear the headlines and they obey, at least members of the conservative community, that the far right community that watches people like Candace Owens or watches people like Tucker Carlson. And Tucker has really been a work of art, so to speak, this particular week, because he's been bringing Marjorie Taylor Greene and others on his broadcast. Interestingly enough, not only condemning Ukraine, but also claiming that the state of Israel is persecuting Christians. That's a separate issue for another day. But with respect to what he's saying about Ukraine, it's literally the opposite of what he's saying happens to be true. You mentioned the declaration of holy war, and you mentioned the Russian Orthodox Church and Patriarch Kirill. Let's remember that ever since Stalin reestablished or allowed religion, he controlled religion. He set up the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow as a means of controlling the Soviet people. He placed KGB agents in the Russian Orthodox Church, and it became the focus or the venue for the persecution of Protestants and anyone that was outside of the Moscow Patriarchate. Russia is presently run by virtually the exact same people that ran the Soviet Union. We have to remember that. Kirill was a KGB agent. Today, he's a branch of the Kremlin under the Russian Orthodox Church. Putin, of course, was a Marxist-Leninist trained KGB agent. He's now probably the wealthiest man in the world and the lifetime dictator. And their message has basically always been the same. If you do not bow to Russia, that's a problem. And now we're going to use religion. Here's a quote. Here's a remarkable quote that they made when they actually came out with their holy war declaration. They said this, quote, "From the spiritual and moral point of view, the special military operation is a holy war in which Russia and its people are defending the single spiritual space of Holy Russia." Now, this is the same basic language we hear in radical Islam applied to Islam. It's the same language of hatred and domination where we see religion being used as a tool to crush people. And yet, according to Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene, if we don't buy into this particular narrative, we're not Christians. You can't be a Christian unless you buy the Kremlin narrative. You can see how perverse and twisted this has become. And honestly, it should be an insult to people that identify, like myself, with Christianity all over the world, that somehow our beliefs would be in any way linked to the Kremlin narrative of mass murder, death, torture, mayhem, and one of the most fundamental Christian principles, which is the Christian theory of just war, which tells us that it is wrong, unprovoked, to invade another nation, to murder its people, to take it simply because I feel threatened or because I want to take it. That's gangster theology, not Christian theology.
And these messages, of course, are being amplified or placed into the media narrative by key individuals. You mentioned Tucker Carlson. There are also people in Congress, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, and others who are very adept at amplifying this kind of stuff. When we look at what they're saying, they seem incredibly unhinged. and yet clearly attention is paid to them and some credence is given to them. Is it because what they say is being amplified by multiple sources and it's not just coming from the mouths of a handful of nutters? Because this is very much technique we see deployed in the Russian media sphere. You put out there some fairly extreme points of view, but you'll also put out moderate points of view, middling points of view, but they all kind of ladder up to the same kind of tone, and you create a polyphony of lies, essentially. And if you're in that system, and if you're not necessarily an individual who wants to question too deeply what's going on, these points of view can start to corroborate each other. So even though you might have the Marjorie Taylor Greens right out on the extreme and you might not like the tone of it, similarly with Trump, you are essentially hearing the same story through a number of different narrative filters, and it moves, or it normalizes those extremities, and it shifts the whole conversation towards the extremes. Is this a similar technique being deployed by Carlson and others?
Jonathan, that's a brilliant insight. I think it's in fact spot on. Not everyone is going to be comfortable with Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has her origins in QAnon-esque thinking and has been confronted for precisely that. But you hear when she speaks tones and accusations that actually hail back to QAnon. Some things she doesn't quite get out the same way, but she's right on the edge. You know, QAnon was saying that Ukraine was a hotbed of 100,000 pedophile rings taking place underground, complete, utter, comprehensive nonsense and lies, that everything that's taking place in Ukraine is a CIA operation, also a lie. And yet she intimated that when she was on the broadcast this week with Tucker Carlson. She spoke around the edges. She's certainly on this far right. But as you point out, there are others that are not quite comfortable going that far. And they're just going to say, well, you know, Ukraine is corrupt. It's corrupt. We just know it's corrupt. Now, they don't tell us what that corruption is. They don't document the corruption. They don't compare that corruption to Russia. They don't compare it to the United States of America or any other nation in the world. But Ukraine is corrupt, we're told. By the way,
Or Germany, that put its entire political system in hock to Russian energy.
Well said, very well said. So I think you're right. The polyphony approach is in fact a strategy which is, whether intentionally or de facto, being practiced here in the United States. But I'll tell you what drives it. What drives it is the extreme. The extreme is what's driving the people to take the other positions, because when Tucker and Marjorie blast social media, every time Tucker gets on his broadcast, he reaches between 10 and 100 million people. Just think about that for a second. And not only is he reaching between 10 and 100 million people in the United States, but he's reaching hundreds of millions of people in Russia, because those broadcasts are put up under Russia Today and various Russian television programs. He is an absolute hero in Russia. And the Kremlin uses Tucker to rally the support of the Russian people. So arguably 500 million people will watch those statements which are made. And there's a trickle-down effect where people pick it up and they start asking questions and they put pressure on their congressman. And the congressman may not be willing to go so far as Marjorie Taylor Greene, but they think, you know, I just don't want to be part of this. I'm concerned. I bet these people are corrupt. It's a problem. I think I just want to back off. And they become afraid. And it's an example of the fact that minorities, dedicated, radicalized minorities, often dictate public policy.
The tricky bit, isn't it, of course, is finding the dotted line to financial sources. This is the bit where people can get quite upset when you start to suggest that because you don't like a point of view, that person is automatically a Kremlin shill and is automatically being paid. I've made suggestions, for instance, in the past, that if academics were shown to benefit from sources of money from the Kremlin, whether it be through awards or prizes or grants or something more nefarious, then at the very least there should be transparency around that. Possibly they should be, disenfranchised from their institutions. And that really touched upon some academic privilege. I had a number of people who were rather upset at that. Don't you dare touch they would frame it in terms of, these are my rights, these are my rights, or these are the rights of academia to say whatever they want. Without transparency, I think is the implication there, which I don't tend to agree with. And the similar thing happens in politics, right? You can criticize these people, but if you try to shut them down, or if you try to point out that their points of view are being paid by a source, somehow that transgresses political rights, whereas what they're actually talking about is privilege. And I think this is this big confusion which we spoke to on the last interview about rights and privilege. And this is why so many debates, especially around, say, gun laws and so on, really get mired in the weeds when one person is talking about absolute rights and the other one is talking about privilege. They're never going to meet in the middle or understand each other. And criticizing Carlson and others comes to this point as well, because there's a lack of transparency about the sources of funding. We cannot know whether their opinions are organic or self-interested, or whether they see it just as internal domestic political advantage, or whether they could be described as in the pay of the Kremlin, Kremlin shills. This is quite a difficult area. We'll come to analysts in a minute, because the same can also be applied, I think, to analysts in this space.
I'd like to tackle the Tucker question, and I want to approach it from the most generous approach I can. So I'd like to be as kind in my assessment of how Tucker ended up where he is. And full disclosure, I've known Tucker, not personally, but my family members that have known him and have interacted with him over the years. We've seen his progress over the years and how he's changed. I have friends at various news networks that have known him and worked with him. So he's not a complete stranger to me. What happened to Tucker Carlson? Is he simply working for the Kremlin? Well, there are some things we can say for absolute surety. Tucker has been interviewed in fact, he went to Dubai and he kind of showed his hand on a number of things. And he indicated, honestly, that he was engaged in vengeance. He specifically said, they went after me, so I want to take them out. I won't, I'm going after these people because they went after me. There's a lot of hatred. There's a lot of animosity. There's things that become extremely personal with him. Then, of course, he also had the issues at Fox. This has had the effect of radicalizing him. Now, if you take radicalization, anger, and vengeance, and you mix that with vast amounts of money, because Tucker is worth hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars personally, comes from a very wealthy family. He's very successful. And the tools to be able to reach hundreds of millions of people, it creates almost a mentality of, honestly, pomposity and a sense of self-worth and power, which can become very, very dangerous. I don't think we even need to conclude that a guy like Tucker is on the payroll of Moscow to understand that this is how demagogues are created. This is the process of how it works. Now, having said that, Jonathan, we can absolutely link his false claims about religious freedom in Ukraine directly to the Kremlin. You say, well, how do we do that? Because we know who he's interviewed. So Tucker, in order to get his claims that Ukraine is killing Orthodox priests, by the way, there isn't one piece of evidence about that has never been suggested by anyone in any credible way whatsoever, or that Ukraine is shutting down an entire denomination, which is a complete misreading, or even that the legislation is passed, which it has not, which is a complete lie, falsehood after falsehood. Where did he get it? He got it from a guy named Bob Amsterdam, who was the guest on Tucker Carlson's show. Bob Amsterdam is a paid lobbyist, basically working for the Kremlin. How does he work for the Kremlin? He works for a gentleman named Vadim Novinsky, who is called Putin's whip when he served in the Ukrainian parliament some time ago, because he was always pushing for Kremlin outcomes. This fellow, who is directly connected to the Russian Orthodox Church and who is basically a 100% Putin sympathizer, is the man paying the bill of the lobbyists in Washington, D.C., who are putting out the reports, and the individuals that are specifically being interviewed by Carlson and quoted by Marjorie Taylor Greene. So in this particular case, we can say with 100% surety, this comes directly from the Kremlin, directly. There's no question about it. We know the source. That's it, and it's Moscow.
It's an interesting question as well, isn't it? Because I think one of the big challenges during Trump's presidency was that For those of us who are perhaps hooked into liberal media, um, and of course, the Kremlin was able, it seems, to manipulate liberal media as much as it was the more right-wing media, but using different mechanisms.
That's right.
The Steele Doctrine has been described by David Satter as a phenomenal piece of Russian tradecraft. And whether that's true or not, what certainly seemed to happen is that the media environment completely turned on itself. With the left and the right absolutely sort of divorced. They're not in the same universe. And of course, if you're looking at the Trump presidency, you could look at all the people who were surrounding him and make definite connections. As you've talked there with the lobbyist to Kremlin influence, there was Manafort, and there were numerous others who, not even tangentially, but absolutely and clearly are very likely to have received cash from the Kremlin as well as talking points. Of course, the conclusion is then made that Trump himself is a Kremlin asset. He may or may not be, but I think the evidence isn't quite there to create that sort of dotted line to the Kremlin. However, you don't need to. You just need to surround him with people who create that impression. And I think that's some of what was going on. But of course, it serves to weaponize the entire environment. Where those who point out the problematic nature of the administration and the people it's coming to rely upon and getting its point of view from, perhaps then exaggerate that and alienate themselves from the sort of cultists or supporters, or even people who are, perhaps a little undecided, but more inclined to go with a administration that is implementing what they perceive to be, the right policies vis-a-vis their religion, lifestyles, culture, and so on. So this is difficult, isn't it? Unpicking that web, and this is one of the powers of the Kremlin: is the ability to inject voices and sources throughout the media and political sphere. How deep do you think this penetration goes, and how many individuals are we talking about?
Well, throughout time, throughout American history, going all the way back to Whittaker Chambers, whose famous book Witness showed us the far deep incursion of the Soviet operations that were taking place in America. And the fact of the matter is that Russia has the most advanced disinformation and propaganda system in the world that the world has ever seen. Never in world history has there been such an advanced, thought through, and well-funded operation. This is what Russia does. And by the way, it is almost astonishing to me that individuals that are not assets, and I think probably are not actual assets, trust Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin more than they trust 42 million people with iPhones on the ground in Ukraine. It's stunning. It's willful ignorance at a level which is just not small. It's a very, very big problem. How far does it go? I think in future years, we may discover went far deeper than we even imagined, because this is what Russia does. This is how they operate. We see them working with documentarians like Oliver Stone. We see them working and supporting various politicians. We see how they have this, whether it's official or unofficial, connection with all sorts of right-wing alternative media sources that are out there, where they interview those people. Those people make pro-Kremlin comments. Those pro-Kremlin comments are broadcast to hundreds of millions of Russians. There's the symbiotic relationship that takes place. But having said all of these things, in terms of the way we present our analysis to people, I'm an advocate for following journalistic standards rigorously, meaning that I don't think that we can do what the extreme left or the extreme right do and says, because it seems this way, therefore it's true. I need more than that. I also happen to be an attorney, and I can tell you that if the arguments that were presented by Tucker and Marjorie were in court, they would be utterly annihilated within minutes of being presented for being purely circumstantial and opinion-oriented as opposed to fact-based. So I don't want us to fall. I don't want supporters of Ukraine. And I have so many dear friends, and they just typically assume, well, he's a Russian asset. Well, he doesn't need to be a Russian asset to still do all the same problems. All he needs to do is be manipulated by Russia. as opposed to being a paid asset, so to speak. And that is a problem.
And it is, isn't it? And not everybody will be aware of this name, but there's a particular divisive figure in Ukraine called Arestovich, and I'm constantly arguing, even with Ukrainians, as to whether he's an asset or whether he's not. But for me, the trick here is if someone tangentially repeats, Kremlin orthodoxy or Kremlin talking points, but it's not consistent and it's mixed up with other stuff and it's sort of punctuated into other discourse, that to me is quite potentially someone who's just getting poor information. If, however, they consistently repeat narratives that are favorable to the Kremlin, if they consistently throw up informational chaff in an almost militarized fashion, then to me that is a clear sign that someone is receiving editorial lines. If they're receiving editorial lines, there will be money exchange at some point, or status or influence, or something that they can actually take to the bank eventually. Now, if we go back, Tucker Carlson, even at his time in Fox, was injecting Russian talking points, highly favorable talking points, right from the start.
Not only injecting Russian talking points, but actually favoring the Russian invasion, trying to argue that we should probably be supporting Russia and what they're doing. Yes, Tucker. The question is whether Tucker is doing it for money. I have no evidence of that. I personally don't think we have to prove that to show that malevolence, anger, disenchantment with the system, a personal mission of vengeance has brought him to the point where the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and where his life mission is to utterly destroy what he perceives to be the establishment, the mainstream media. And in the context of that mission of destruction that Tucker has, he finds a very, very helpful ally in Vladimir Putin. And so he goes to Moscow and he says, look how beautiful Moscow is. Look, it's better than any city in the United States of America. What does that tell us about Putin? A statement of such cosmic ignorance. I'm going to tell you something, and I think about this a lot, Jonathan. And I wonder if most people could really fathom the implications of what I'm about to say. Tucker Carlson is not an educated man. I'm not saying that to be mean. I'm not saying that to be unkind. I don't mean that to belittle him. I mean that sincerely. He's not educated. When he went on the show with Andrew Tate, he talked about not knowing the geography of Ukraine. He said he just found it out on the way to Romania. I want you to think about the power of a man reaching billions of people over time, talking about Ukraine and acknowledging he doesn't know where it is on the map. And then projecting that on the rest of America. Well, because I don't know, therefore nobody knows. His interview with Vladimir Putin indicated he genuinely knew nothing, not only of the history of Russia. He came completely unprepared at that interview. He did not know how to handle what was coming at him. He accepted things that should have never been accepted. His understanding from 1991 to the present was abysmal, almost non-existent. And Tucker sincerely is not educated. And that makes him even more dangerous, because the one thing he knows, he's sure of, is that everybody is lying. Everyone's lying except for me, meaning Tucker Carlson. That creates a very dangerous person. And that kind of a person doesn't need to receive one penny from the Kremlin. Kremlin can use him in other ways, like inviting him to Moscow.
Is there potentially here some domestic political interest? Is he possibly looking beyond Trump's term of office, thinking he's got this audience, he's got this reach? He almost certainly believes that he understands that constituency well. May he have his eyes on the top prize? And essentially, he may be poorly educated, but it strikes me that he is smart at manipulating people. And he may well believes that, well, Trump couldn't pull off, taking America down a dictatorial single party route, but he perhaps believes he could be the one to pull that off.
By the way, if Donald Trump becomes president of the United States, Tucker Carlson will become an adversary to Donald Trump. So it's the present alliance is only that. It's a present temporary alliance. He's been a foe of Trump in the past. He'll be a foe of Trump in the future. If Trump serves Tucker's purpose, he'll use them, and if not, he's out. Whether or not Tucker has political ambitions, I couldn't say. I think that he probably feels very secure in his position. He would be giving up a lot if he decided, a lot of power if he decided to become a political person. That being said, it's been offered to him, or many people have suggested that, you know, he should be the vice presidential candidate, or someday in the future, he should be the spokesman. If you watch Tucker, he actually has, when he's not on his show and he's being interviewed, you see his appeal. There's a lot of humanity in the way he talks and the way he describes things. He's very personal. He says things which on its face, many people might agree with. It's just he applies them in ways which are horrific. And in fact, this is nothing new to the world. The same things took place in 1930s Germany, where people would, you know, say things that, you know, we want to clean up our streets. We want to get rid of the brothels. Don't we want Germany to be a moral country again? Surely we want it to be a moral. Do you remember the days when there was prosperity before all of this wickedness came into Germany? And that is very appealing to people when they're suffering and when they're upset, because there are effects to vice. It does destroy a country. And when demagogues learn to play upon that, and then they provide solutions which are far worse than the problem themselves. So Tucker has found that sweet spot right now. I don't know if he'll cross the bridge into actually being a leader. People want him to. I think it would be a bad move for his own power base to do that.
And there's two other areas I think it would be really useful to focus on. We've talked about religion being weaponized in the Kremlin narrative. Let's talk a little bit about the genuine status of freedom of belief in Ukraine and why they understand that the Russian Orthodox Church under the Moscow Patriarch is something that is essentially a spying operation, and why it needs to be repressed for political, not religious reasons. So I'd love to hear a little bit about genuine religious freedom. And then the last question after that, where we'll end up on, is where do we go from here, and how do we try to tackle these toxic narratives? Because it's good to focus on action, on things people can take away and do, rather than just feeling depressed about it. But as someone, as you say, of religious faith, what has struck you about religion in Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia?
Well, I want to begin by just making a comment about the present controversy over the bill which is going through, is being considered. Number one, the bill in Ukraine. The bill, because it's representative of the broader issue of religious freedom in Ukraine. Number one, the bill has not been passed. Number two, Zelensky has actually been very cautious and has not been a principal supporter of this bill. The people have been crying out for the bill. Does the bill ban a denomination? No, it does not. Does the bill ban freedom of worship? No, it does not. Does the bill create new laws? It doesn't do any of those things. What the bill says is that if there are individuals or churches which are in alignment with countries that are at war with Ukraine, that is prohibited. Furthermore, it says that if people that are part of that engage in criminal acts, they should be prosecuted. Now, let me ask you a question, or ask our audience a question. If a priest commits murder, should he go to jail? If a priest commits pedophilia, should he go to jail? If a priest helps Russian soldiers murder Orthodox priests, which are outside the patriarchy, should he go to jail? If a priest reveals information about the location of Ukrainian soldiers to Russians who then go and commit atrocities against Ukrainians, should that priest go to jail? Everything I've just told you has actually happened. There's only a small fraction of Muscovite priests that are in jail. 22 have been placed in jail because of actual criminal activity which is taking place. There's been no killing of Russian Orthodox priests. On the other hand, wherever the Russians have been, they've destroyed Protestant churches, utterly wiped them out. We have reports of them walking into Protestant worship services and requiring everybody's fingerprints in the middle of the worship service. Then they blow up the buildings afterwards. They take the pastors prisoner. The number of reports, which are growing constantly, of Russians performing horrific acts against religious leaders that are outside the Moscow Patriarchy, are deeply disturbing. Electrocuting genitals, sitting there with Russian Orthodox priests and soldiers while pastors are being persecuted. These are not one or two examples. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of examples of these. These are documented, they are reported, and wherever the Russians go, they commit murder against Christians that are outside. You might ask why? Because they believe those churches are anathema, because Kirill has said they are anathema. There's one church which is acceptable, that's the Moscow Patriarchate. And when you tell the soldiers, which they have told them, that if you murder or kill in the name of the Moscow Patriarchy, you're absolved of their sins, it actually becomes an incentive for all sorts of war crimes, which is precisely what's happened. So to answer your question, what is the real state of religious freedom in Ukraine? Ukraine has one of the strongest religious freedom foundations. It is the strongest in all of Eastern Europe, and it's actually one of the strongest in the world. More Christians go to worship of different background in Ukraine every Sunday than in the United States of America. I had the privilege of interviewing Armenian Orthodox, Ukrainian members of the separated Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Catholics, Eastern Orthodox of various stripes, Jews, Muslims, Baptists, Pentecostals, Assemblies of God. I spoke with all of them. I went into their houses of worship, and there was a very simple message I heard from everybody. It had two parts to it. Number one, the Moscow Patriarchy in Ukraine is a spy operation working to kill us. And number two, we have more religious freedom in this country than we've ever experienced in our life. This is the freest it has ever been, ever. And we are loving it, and we want to keep it. So the perception that somehow this is this horrible world of religious persecution is utterly absurd. It's false. The facts do not substantiate it. One more thing I just want to mention, Jonathan. Before we start screaming at other nations, of which we know very little, we should take a look at the United States' own track record. During the Second World War, now understand, when nations are at war, there's a lot of fear. People are trying to kill you. You have spies on your land. There's an awful lot at stake. And so it's not uncommon during wartime for political regimes to take very extreme measures. Let's not forget the 130,000 Japanese that were incarcerated in the United States of America, and the hundreds of churches that the Japanese attended, which were shut down in the United States of America because we were concerned that the Japanese might be spying for Tokyo. I feel that was a colossal mistake on the part of the United States of America. It was a very big mistake. And it isn't the first time we've had those mistakes. If you go all the way back to the Alien and Sedition Act of the John Adams administration, if you criticized the president of the United States during wartime, you went to jail. Similar things happened during World War I, and probably Tucker, because I don't think he's even studied the subject, may not be aware that Dwight D. Eisenhower was the president that signed the bill banning the Communist Party in the United States of America. So we're tossing out these statements. They're banning religious freedom. They're attacking political parties. This isn't a democracy. There is nothing that Ukraine has done which comes close to what the United States has done in the past in the name of wartime freedom. Nothing, absolutely nothing. And furthermore, the fact that there are all these different parties, that there are all these different religions, that people are content, we should be taking a lesson from Ukraine rather than criticizing them. They really are setting remarkable standards, and they're working very, very hard for this. But the great tragedy is that nothing, and I mean nothing, is said by Carlson or Marjorie Taylor Greene about the real terrorism, the real religious persecution which is taking place from the greatest persecutor in the world, and that's Moscow. Wherever they happen to occupy, they kill Christians.
And let's end on the question of what we do about this, because those of us who are in the sort of pro-Ukrainian bubble, and there are many sort of filmmakers, journalists, activists who have been trying to counter these messages, these lies, for the last 2 years. It is perhaps a shame that we didn't do that more vigorously since 2014, but at least now many people have joined the fight and now understand what Ukraine is talking about. But it seems like there is an endless tide of lies, a tsunami of lies. What should we do at this point to try and counter what you're talking about, which is the weaponized information, which seems to be polluting the information space?
Well, I'd like to begin by saying that within the American political system, there has been no meaningful and intelligent response to disinformation. It's almost been non-existent. Now, having said that, there are organizations. I really appreciate my friend Stephen Moore, who's doing an amazing job fighting on behalf of Ukraine and dealing with the issue specifically. There are other smaller groups here and there that are engaged, but by and large, our politicians in Washington, D.C. are not making the case intelligently. They're simply allowing the bombs to drop, the argument bombs to drop, and they're not responding. When was the last time you heard any political leader counter the falsehood of Marjorie Taylor Greene? They want to ignore her. They want to not deal with it. They want to say, well, we see it differently, but they're either too afraid or too busy to deal with it. So part of the work of my organization, Ukraine Story, is we address this through journalism. We address this through documentary filmmaking, and our approach is persuasion. We don't want to simply rally people that already agree with us. We want to persuade people that have yet to be informed. Because of my personal background, I think I understand people on the right. I understand people that are conservative and that are Christian and what their thinkings are, what their fears are. And quite honestly, they're not hearing from anyone. So it's helpful to go issue by issue and present them with, whether it's articles or whether it's documentary filmmaking. But at the end of the day, there's a bigger problem. And the bigger problem is we have to defend propositional truth. If you look at the arguments of Tucker and his team and his ilk, I should say, they're not arguing for any propositional truth. They're simply shouting out headlines that are meant to destroy, headlines that are meant to shut things down. What are they actually arguing for? Are they really arguing for isolationism? Yes, but none of them are consistent. None of them consistently hold to a true isolationist position. In fact, I would say that if there was a single conservative or liberal for that matter that was willing to make a constitutional argument against Ukraine, I would listen to it. If they were, I mean, I wouldn't agree with it, but I'd listen to it. If they were willing to make a principled argument, in all these 2 years since the full-scale invasion, I haven't heard one single principled argument from people that are anti-Ukraine. It's all, well, this is CIA. Well, we provoke them. Well, look at what's happening here. Well, I don't like the way Zelensky dresses. Well, look at his face. Well, look at this. Well, we've got problems over here. No one has attempted to mount a principled argument. So our approach is to make a principled argument. What is America's interest? What should be our policy? What is ethically the correct approach to warfare? What's the world we want to be part of as we move forward into the future? That's really important. And to me, that's informed by Christian and humanitarian values, which are fundamental to freedom. And those are not being talked about. So I think we need to get back to talk about these different things. And at the very least, I hope to return to a world where rational people will be able to say, it's wrong to attack civilians. It's wrong to target civilians. It's wrong to murder and destroy children. That's wrong. It's wrong to invade someone's sovereign territory. That's wrong. And it doesn't matter how threatened you feel. We all feel threatened all the time. That is not justification for invading another nation and disturbing the entire law order of the modern world. We need to get back to that. And that argument has to be made.
And I think, like propaganda, which is on a continuously being pumped out, I think what you and I do, what other people in the sphere, Joseph Lindsley and others, Stephen Moore, do is they put out information day in, day out to not just counter the narrative, but counter the cadence of propaganda as well.
Very well said. Someday I hope that Joe Lindsley, who is a true American hero, and Stephen Moore and men like yourself will be recognized as people that were just fighting the ground effort, just day after day after day, not merely countering false propaganda, but communicating hope. That's part of the message. One of the things we do, by the way, is we tell stories of hope. We tell the stories of Ukrainian athletes and people that overcame problems, and just this remarkable message that Ukraine is giving the world of what can happen when we put aside petty squabbles and we unify over a core value, which is life and death. And they've done that, I think, better than any nation I've seen in the world. They are truly the greatest underdog story of our generation. We need to be listening to them.
No, couldn't agree more. And there are so many stories of heroism that I think in future will be covered if we can get through this period. If we can get through this period and get back to a place of truth and discourse, which is, I would say, non-partisan, that goes beyond the kind of weaponized divisions that we're currently seeing. But let's do more of these videos. I think it's incredibly instructive speaking to you. It's incredibly important that people sort of discover the work that you are doing and some of the other people we've mentioned and create an alternative ecosystem to the sort of weaponized lies that we see being created by ecosystems that are sponsored by Carson, Trump, and others like them. Thanks so much for joining the channel again. I hope the audience really engages with this. It's incredibly stimulating for me because this is a very different angle for me to cover on the channel, but such an important one as well. So thank you for coming on again to explain this.
Jonathan, I'm so grateful to be here. And I want to say, think about this. Trillions of dollars, certainly hundreds of billions, are being spent for false information. You're doing this for free. You're using your time for free to help because you believe in this. And that's why I hope people will support your channel. They'll buy you cups of coffee. They'll help you out. The fact of the matter is that the army of people that are fighting for freedom are doing it because we believe in it with all of our heart and soul, not because we're getting paid by the elites.